Now, in past chapters we learned how to use specular maps and normal maps to enhance our color maps, but we didn't learn how to create them. This isn't really a texturing DVD, but because these kinds of textures are so critical to creating decent materials, I'm going to show you how to make them. So let's open up the blend file, texturemaps.blend. Here I have a plane that I've already UV mapped with a stone wall texture. It doesn't have a material or an actual texture yet. The way I'm previewing it now in the 3D view is by enabling the option here under the shading panel called Textured Solid. So instead of regular solid shaded view where it would just be gray, we see any images applied to it. Let's start out by adding material and texture for it. So go to the material buttons, add a new material, and let's change the specular intensity down to 0 because we're going to be controlling the shininess with our specular map. And go over to the texture buttons, add a new texture, rename it color, change the type to image, and load in Stonewall Col as the image. Scroll down a little, and under the mapping panel, change coordinates from generated to UV. So it uses our UV coordinates to map this texture to the plane. Now if you have GLSL enabled on the right side here under the shading options, you can get a preview of the final render by pressing Alt and Z for textured shaded view in the 3D view. So that's pretty much what it's going to look like when we render it. And right now you can tell it's very flat, very lifeless. We're going to add some shine to it with the specular map, and we're going to bump out all these bricks with the normal map. So let's start by converting the color map. You can use any paint program you want. This is a pretty simple process. I'm going to use Photoshop, so open that up, and then let's open up from the Project Textures folder the texture Stonewall Col. That's the color map we're using. So we're going to turn this into a specular map by just simply making it grayscale. And then the white parts will be max shininess and black parts will have no shininess. That's the general rule for a basic specular map. So we can make that desaturated by pressing Control, Shift, and U. Or going into the Image menu, Adjustments, Desaturate. Now press Control and L. And let's simply adjust the levels to get a good look. So it's a stone wall, so it's not all that shiny, but some of the rocks are going to have sort of this dusty shininess look on their surface. So I'm going to make the levels really extreme, something like that. And then press OK. And that's it. That's our specular map. It's just a black and white color. It's just a black and white texture map where the light areas are shiny and the black areas are not. So let's save that as Stonewall Spec. And now let's go back into Blender. Select the plane and add a new texture for it. So click on the slot beneath color, add a new texture, name this specular, change it to the image type, and open up the image we just created, Stonewall Spec. Change the mapping coordinates to UV, disable color, enable RGB to intensity, and then enable intensity for specular. And rotate the view so you catch the light bouncing off the wall at the right angle to see how good the specular map is. And it's pretty good. That's good enough for a specular map for a stone wall. Again, I'm in textured shaded view with GLSL enabled. That's what's allowing me to see the material and textures on this plane and the light bouncing off it and showing us the specular map. Now let's get to work on that normal map. Let's go back into Photoshop and load in that color map again. Stonewall Col. First let's make it grayscale. Press Ctrl, Shift, and U. Well, it doesn't exactly make it grayscale, it just technically desaturates it. And now make a note that when we convert this to a normal map, it will assume that all the dark areas are the lower areas and all the lighter areas are the parts that bump out. So press Ctrl and L and let's adjust the levels a little bit just to make the details a little more extreme. That looks good enough. After that, go into Filter, NVIDIA Tools, and select Normal Map Filter. Here's links you can go to download the Normal Map plugin for both Photoshop and GIMP. Now once you have that installed, then you can go into the Filter menu, down to NVIDIA Tools, and select Normal Map Filter. And here's where the magic happens. So the filter sizes over here determine how soft or sharp the detail is. The lower the number, the sharper the detail. I'm going to stay with 3 by 3, put scale up to 12, and make sure average RGB is enabled for the height source, since we're not using any kind of alpha data here. And make the alpha field set to 1.0 if it isn't already. And you can leave everything else the same. And then press OK. And that's our result. Now it looks pretty cool. But let's see how it looks in Blender. One very important thing to note first is that Blender reads normal maps differently than the Photoshop filter writes them. So when you convert an image to a normal map with Photoshop, the result is not perfect for Blender yet. If we use this as is, the lighting will not bounce off the surface correctly. All we need to do to fix this, though, is go over here to the Channels tab, select the red channel, and press Ctrl and I to invert the colors. Then click on the RGB channel again to display them all. The RGB channels here are what contain all the lighting information Blender needs to simulate geometry on a flat surface. We needed to flip the red channel because Blender reads this channel a different way. But that's all we need to do. It's ready to go now. So go to File, Save As, and save that as Stonewall Nor. Now open up Blender again, and let's load this in as a normal map. So go to an empty texture slot, and add a new texture in. Name it Normal. Change the type to Image, and open up Stonewall Nor. You'll see it on the plane there. Then go to the Image Sampling panel, enable Normal Map, change the mapping coordinates to UV, disable Color, and under the Geometry options, enable Normal. You'll see it bumps out now, and it's really gritty looking. Didn't exactly make it mind-blowingly awesome. That method seems to capture the sharp details of an image, but the result is still something pretty flat. But that's the basic idea of how you create specular and normal maps. You can adjust the amount of bumpiness with this field here. So if we put that down a little bit to maybe 0.4, that's a little bit better. But again, it's really only capturing those sharp details. And this method might work fine for lots of different textures, but a stone wall can be really bumpy. And that's what we're going to deal with next. You know the basic method for creating normal maps now. But let's create a normal map that actually takes these stones and brings them to life. And there are programs for making better normal maps from color maps, programs like Crazy Bump. But there's a way to do it manually that allows you more control as well. And for that we'll be using sculpting and normal map baking in Blender. So follow my lead with this. First I'm going to save this file so that we can come back to it. Now start a new file. Delete the default cube, and in top view add a mesh plane. Now what we're going to do is create something called a displacement map to make our texture actually affect our mesh. So open up Photoshop and open up our Stonewall color map again. We're going to make a displacement map out of this color map. Let's make this grayscale. Control, Shift, and U. Press Control and L, and let's adjust the levels so that the details are really extreme. Something to that effect. And press OK. And save this as Stonewall Disp for displacement. Now let's go back into Blender and go into edit mode of the plane and make sure everything's selected. Now in the image window, load in the displacement map we just created. You'll see that since we were in edit mode with everything selected, when we load an image in the image window, it automatically UV maps the plane to it. So that work was done for us. Now that that's applied to the plane, let's go to the modifiers buttons and add a displace modifier. So go to the modifier buttons here and add the modifier displace. Now here we can load a texture in to displace the mesh, but first we need to create that texture. So go to the texture buttons, and here in the texture options, the checkerboard icon, we can add a texture for displacement. So click on New and add a new image texture and load in our displacement image. Now go back to the modifiers and you'll see that the texture is automatically plugged in to the modifier now. So the mesh is now being displaced based on the detail in our displacement image. But you can't really tell because the mesh only has 4 vertices. So let's go into edit mode, and with everything selected, let's subdivide that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. So it has plenty of detail to work with. Whoa. And look at what we did. Now that's no big deal. That's only because we have the strength still set at 1. There's a few things we need to change now. First, let's change the direction to Z so that this only displaces up and down. Then change texture coordinates to UV to make sure it uses the UV coordinates we use. And now let's bring strength down all the way to 0.1. Go in top view and let's look at this mess. For the shading there. And you start to see the details of the displacement map we just made. But let's bring strength down a little bit more to 0.05. Alright, a little bit more, 0.01. There we go, perfect. Now you can see the texture displacing our plane. So to recap how I did this, so I added a plane, then I added a displace modifier for the plane, and then I added a texture for displacement and used our displace image that we created. I changed the direction to Z so that it only displaces straight up and straight down. Changed the texture coordinates to UV and the strength to 0.01. So we used an image to modify a mesh and make it bump up and down. Now what we're going to do is use sculpting to pull every one of these stones up a little higher so that they stick out. And then we're going to bake that into a normal map. But first, let's apply this modifier so that it becomes real and then we can sculpt it. So just click on apply, and then that displacement has now been applied to the mesh. And now we can work on sculpting it. Now to start sculpting, we can change the mode here from object mode to sculpt mode, and a little brush appears. Expand the side toolbar for all your different brush options. Let's give ourselves some room here. If you click on this icon here, you'll have all your different brush types. But I'm going to leave it as Sculpt Draw, because this is what we want. If you left click on the plane and drag the mouse, you'll see wherever you click and drag, it bumps the surface up. Press Ctrl and Z to undo that. And here's all of our options over here. You have the radius, which is the size of the brush, and the strength, which is the density of the paint, and then lots of different options. One thing we want to enable right off the bat is under the Options panel, let's lock the X and Y axis so that when we paint, it'll only bump straight up and straight down. Perfectly square for when we go to bake the normal map later. So lock X and Y under the options and leave everything else the same. To change the radius with a hotkey, you can press the F key and it changes the size of the brush. To change the strength, you can press Shift and F. So now we can start painting. What exactly are we going to be painting? Well, we're going to be going over every one of these little stones we see and simply left clicking on it and bumping it out like that. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just wherever you see a stone, left click and drag. Now some of the detail is kind of hard to see. Like I can't tell where the stones start and stop in this area here. But I know we have a texture map applied to it. We have the displacement map applied to it. So I want to see that. So to enable us to see that, I'm going to open up the side toolbar here and enable textured solid. There we go. Now I can see where all the detail is. And I can left click and drag on each of these stones now. So I'm going to go through. I'm going to continuously turn this on and off to make sure I'm painting right. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to paint over every single little stone until I have a nice looking stone wall. So once you're done tracing over the stones, it'll look something like this. Now you can see this is going to turn into a really good normal map. And a couple more tools that might help you when you're doing this is if you brought a stone up too high, you can always click on subtract here and it pushes it down instead of bumping it up. And also if a stone is a little bit too rocky, like this one here has maybe a couple too many bumps, you can change the brush type to smooth. Then when you left click and drag over that area, it'll smooth it out. Alright, so we're finished with the sculpting part. Now let's go back into object mode. Get rid of the toolbar. And let's add another plane. So make sure the cursor is still in the center. You can recenter it by pressing Shift and C. Press Shift and A and add another mesh plane. And it should be the same exact size as the plane we just sculpted. Go into edit mode of the new plane, and with everything selected, go to the image window, click on image and select new image and press OK. Well, make sure that the width and height are the same size as the color map that you're using, or the normal map that you're using. And 1024 by 1024 is the same size, so press OK. And now we've UV mapped this plane to a plain black image. Now let's get out of edit mode and go to the render buttons. Scroll all the way down and expand the bake panel. Change the bake mode from full render to normals and enable selected to active. We're going to bake the normals from the mesh we sculpted onto this flat plane. So because we're baking selected to active, first we make our selection. So select the sculpt plane, hold Shift, and select the new plane that we just created, which is now the active selection. So it's going to bake the sculpt mesh onto this flat plane. So now that that is done, all that's left to do is press bake. And let's see what happens. There we go. So the reason we created a new image is so that this normal map could be baked to it, could be painted onto it. So now all that's left to do is save this image. So go to Image, click on Save as Image, and let's save this. Let's save this as Stonewall Nor 2. We're going to mix this with the other normal map. So not only do we have this sculpted detail, but we also have the sharp detail that the other normal map has. So save that as Stonewall Nor 2. And let's open up Photoshop and mix the two together. So let's open them both up. Stonewall Nor and Stonewall Nor 2. And let's copy Stonewall Nor 2 by selecting everything, pressing Ctrl and C, and let's paste it on top of Stonewall Nor. And let's make this the bottom layer, and select the top layer, the sharp detail. Let's change the blending mode to overlay, and change the opacity to 15. Now you'll see we have the bumpiness of the sculpted normal map plus the sharp detail of the one that we made in Photoshop. So this should be a decent normal map now. So let's save that as Stonewall Nor .png, which is going to save over the normal map we had before. And let's open up Blender again. I'm going to save this. Let's load back in the file that we were working on before, which will be in the project folder, blends, texture maps 4. Well, that's what I named it. So let's open that back up. And our normal map should have updated, and it did, but remember we decreased the normal value here. So let's crank that back up to 1. There we go. That looks a whole lot better now. Now let's move the light around and see how this looks. That looks good. That's much bumpier now. It may seem like a long process, but there may be instances where creating a normal map manually like this will be essential to give you the best results. And now you know how to bake normals from a high-resolution object to a low-res object. This is incredibly useful for things like game characters, where you want to use the normals from a high-res sculpted character on a lower-res character mesh. In the game creation overview in the next volume, you'll learn more about baking and how to bake things like ambient occlusion and shadows into light maps, which make your scene look 1,000 times more awesome. So this has been a basic overview of just how to use specular maps and normal maps, how to create them, and how to make them even better than what the Photoshop filter gives you.